fruity. Leicestershire and Rutland is prominent with oolite, a sedimentary rock formed from ooids, spherical grains composed of concentric layers. Most ooids are calcium carbonate rich, but can also be phosphate, clays, or iron minerals, including hematite, which is a common iron oxide compound with the formula Fe2O3. It is widely found in rocks and soils. It is not to be confused with siderite, which is iron carbonate. A valuable iron ore, it consists of 48% iron and lacks other elements commonly substituted for the iron. Extracting iron from siderite is an expensive process. The counties never ran out of it, but it became too expensive to produce. Initial workings started in 1861 at Neville Holt by W.J. Roseby, then in 1862 to B. Thornton, and Roseby's son from 1871 to 74. The quarries were served by a tramway with a cable-operated incline leading across the River Welland to the LNWR Rugby and Stamford line at Holt Junction. These were the first ironstone quarries intended for ironstone smelting in the county. Ironstone as a building material has been extracted for many centuries before. A wealth of resources is required in order to extract the material. Initial quarries were loaded onto carts and taken away by pack animal. Railways built for the specific purpose of ironstone soon popped up, the first here north of Melton at Holwell. The Midland Railway took the first steps by hurrying a single line to Asfordby on their planned route from Nottingham to Kettering in order to meet the narrow gauge Holwell Mineral Railway, which was soon bought out by the Midland and converted to standard gauge. Other companies also laid similar railways. I've pieced together the history of the sidings which ran into quarries and mines. Most sidings were narrow gauge and they met standard gauge trains at tippers. They had a maintenance shed for locomotives. They would extract the first 30 feet and skim across the field before digging the next 80 feet and then filling back in at the end. And in most cases the quarry has a start and end date, but this is synonymous with the track laid to transport the ore. Over the passage of time, there are lots of workings in one field, and I've kept this to a minimum, such as this diagram, which is far more detailed than I've recorded. Let's have a quick look on the map of the videos produced so far, and then explain how I'm going to deliver this extensive history of ironstone. We look initially at the early railway sidings around Holwell in section 1. Then at the High Dyke branch we look at the county overlap with Rutland, Leicestershire and Lincolnshire in section 2. South of this is the Cottesmore sidings including Exton and just about all the ironstone within Rutland in section 3. And finally in all the other leftovers like Tilton and Uppingham, and we include the earliest mines in Neville Holt in section 4. The quarrying and mining of ironstone was quickly mechanised, with vast behemoths and some record-breaking drag lines of 1,700 tonnes with separate engines and controllers to each section, driving its direction, its swing and its reach. From the early days, steam shovels were employed and gradually they got much bigger. It was from Exton that Sundew famously walked to Corby and featured in the press at the time. The vastness of the landscape that was torn up can better be understood in the 27-ton bucket regularly filling waiting wagons nearby. These wagons were then herded with shunting locos and loaded onto inclines, negotiating steep hills in a straight line to the tipper on standard gauge. Those wagons would then be shunted to the furnaces of Middlesbrough, Scunthorpe or Corby. There is no photo of the aerial ropeways which were also used, or of any of the sidings which went underground into mines. Holwell and Wartnaby are hamlets within the civil parish of Ab Kettleby, population 529. Wartnaby was under the ownership of Stanton Ironworks. Land was leased by J.G. and G. Crompton from the Bingham family of Wartnaby Hall. Practically everything in the 500-foot contour was available, with easy pickings from outcrop and no need for heavy machinery. It was all hand dug with a few explosives here and there. Much activity featured around Stone Pit House on the Six Hills Road. Just out of shot is the Midland-Nottingham line, where this 3-foot narrow gauge tramway reached, via a 1 in 15 incline, a tipping dock north of the old Dalby Tunnel, where ore was transferred to standard gauge and then exclusively delivered to Stanton Ironworks in Nottingham. Locomotives were named Bottersford, Stanton and Harston, many with numbers. Over its time, locomotives were borrowed and lent to other quarries, but it seems that 6 was the optimum working number, though for its first year the wagons were horse-drawn. The Midland surveys of the Nottingham to Kettering route by Colonel Dalgleish noted the soil around Melton Mowbray showed strong red colours, and upon further analysis confirmed that ironstone was present and worth extracting. Dalgleish and his partner Howard Allport, that's the son of James Allport of the Midland Railway, initially spoke with Staveley Coal and Iron Company Limited, but in 1875 he left the Midland Railway to form the Holwell Iron Company as managing director, with Allport on board. Transport for the ore went initially by road. By creating a branch line from the Kettering route and connecting to the Syston and Peterborough Railway, this allowed national delivery in January 1877. Foundations for the Holwell works was laid in 1878, with the first furnace fired up in December 1881. The Holwell branch extended several times during 1884 to 86 and even featured in Bradshaw's railway manuals. A branch was planned to Scalford but never built. Stanton Ironworks applied for lease of land neighbouring Holwell's quarrying area, and the Cromptons, directors of Stanton's, were also in the area for Wartnaby. Cordial relations with Stanton and Holwell made this area simple to mine. Funiculars were likely in use to get from the branch line to the narrow gauge workings, which were likely to have been 1 foot 9.5 inch, 546 millimetres. Roads around here were diverted to get underneath them, and during the 1931 to 43 period, some areas were mined rather than quarried. The narrow gauge workings were all gone by 1956, but ore was still quarried and distributed by road, and out of the area of focus for these videos. The development of the National Coal Board's Asfordby mine complex in 1986 obliterated any remains of the Holwell branch. Eric Tonks compares Eaton to Holwell as a village in a hollow, which ends up surrounded in ironstone activity, all eventually controlled by Stewart's and Lloyd's Minerals and Staveley Minerals Limited. By now, you're well familiar with the Leicestershire railways being built purely for freight, the Leicester and Swannington for coal and granite, the Ashby and Nuneaton joint line for coal, the Charnwood Forest Railway for granite, and the Great Northern and London North Western joint line for ironstone. These branches and sidings are no exception, except that here in the Eastwell area, the lines are constructed entirely by the Great Northern Railway, brought about entirely due to the Midland falling out with the landowner, the Duke of Rutland. Tackling gradients of 1 in 50 led to an 8-wheeled brake van with a Class 4 locomotive on this purely Great Northern branch from a joint line. Hartington Iron and Steel Company signed a long contract for supply of the ore direct to Earlham near Manchester from 1912. Holwell Iron Company operated here also. Leases from 1882 in Waltham and in 1883 to Eaton, which flourished after the Waltham quarries were not productive and closed in 1885, sending all work to Eaton. Noted activity took place at Duke's and Hurst's, pits named after the Duke of Rutland and landowner Mrs. Hurst. Prior to the arrival of an upgraded dragline in 1942, when continuous production was dictated by the War Office, the narrow gauge had fared well, but soon lorry traffic took control in 1946 as the rails were lifted, unable to cope with supply. In 1911, new areas were quarried, but only at outcrop. Locomotives were named Ironstone, Adderley, Jason, Holwell, Curzon and Darlington, all of a 040 formation, but of varying gauges of between 3 foot and 3 foot 2 and 5/8 inches, that's 910 to 1082 millimetres. Horses operated on the standard gauge flat track at Bagshaw's pit. Windmill Hill pit had good quality ironstone under thin cover, but had been unreachable, and the plan to install a siding from Godeby Marwood proved challenging, especially from other companies whose rails were required. So an aerial ropeway, which saw 2 upgrades, was used for successive years. The loading station for the ropeway was in a field where the narrow gauge terminus was accompanied by an administrative building with some sand and water on hand. The narrow gauge wagons emptied into a bunker with a collapsing floor, where buckets were filled and the ore was carried across the valley attached to the rope. There, the bunker was removed from the rope onto a ball rail, rolled around and emptied into a large steel bunker with trapdoors which fed waiting standard gauge wagons below. The buckets were then rolled around to meet the rope, having passed through a loop to return. There's only one known photo of the ropeway, but Tom Scott does a superb video explaining how Britain's sole surviving ropeway in Clafton, Lancashire works. That's worth watching. Locomotives Harston, Holwell and Stanton, liveried in red-brown lined black and light green lined black edged with white with red couplers, saw service here. The ropeway eventually broke in May 1948 and transfer continued by lorry. Basic Quarry had a 2-foot gauge track with locomotive Pixie and a shorter standard gauge track with loco Douglas. The independence of Mill Hill Quarry, surrounded by big competitors, went unfazed. Even the naming of it was from a nearby quarry. An unnamed 6-coupled Peckett worked the short but uphill branch. Lorries took over in 1963, many using the tramway routes now free of rails. To the north of this activity was Waltham Quarries. The short-lived, unsuccessful Waltham Quarries by Waltham on the Wold Station hosted the Holwell Iron Company Limited, but north of Eaton, at the end of the Great Northern Branch, some distance away from Waltham, there was an extension of workings that cut into the hillsides which surround Belvoir Castle. It was the same company and they retained their name, only the location had changed. As all the tramways in use during this period, the enthusiast was particularly entertained, and none so more than here. The metre gauge track and position high on the plateaus made for an interesting scenery and differing from the 3-foot gauge at Eastwell. The company was sponsored by James Oakes and Company Limited and managed by Staveley Coal and Iron Company Limited. An extension had been applied to the Duke of Rutland, who gave permission, and work started here, whilst the original Waltham tramways were still in operation, which eventually failed due to the poor quality of the Northampton sand ironstone versus the milestone further north. All tramways fed into a single-hand operated tipping dock after a junction for the loco shed and offices. Names of pits matched the geography. Green Lane changed its name later to Tofts Road, and the expected pit name of Swain's Lodge was named Long Hole. Quarrying here was shallow. A small section by Terrace Hills Farm was extracted, but soon quarrying moved to Bolton's and Reservoir Wood, and gradual extraction continued until after World War II. Locomotives were George Bond, Rutland, John Green in 1880, and Beaver in 1885, and had been built by Staveley. Dreadnought arrived in 1910 and the Baronet shortly after. Other locos borrowed from other quarries included Holwell No. 6 and French-built Cambrai and Nantes arriving in 1956. A 15-ton Ruston shovel was employed at Reservoir Wood until closure. During World War II, the quarries were practically exhausted, especially with the addition of a dragline in 1944. Two unnamed diesel machines operated at High Lees, Granby and Hearts in the post-war period. In 1958, there was a depression in the industry and some farmers took advantage of the tramways and tipping docks for their sugar beet. Otherwise, it was eerily silent as locos sat amongst birdsong, and eventually all track was lifted in 1959. Trees had already grown in the tracks and needed to be removed prior to lifting in 1964, as well as some alterations to the roads near the tipping dock.